Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we're going to pick up where we left off in chapter 17. We're talking about money supply and inflation. And we just learned that there was the quantity theory of money. And there's two ways we can think of the quantity theory of money. We could think about it in a supply and demand equation or a supply and demand graph, where supply is vertical and demand is downward sloping, and the intersection give us the price and the value of money. We saw that in the last video. And then we also saw the equation MV equals PY. And we're still learning how to use that equation. And in this example that we have in front of us, we're going to try to calculate or use that equation to calculate different things. So let's get into it. So we're assuming that there's only one good in the economy, corn. The economy has enough labor, capital, and land to produce 1,800 bushels of corn. Okay, V is constant. In 2019, money supply was 3,600, and the price of corn was $8 a bushel. So that sentence in the middle, the economy had enough labor, capital, and land to produce 1,800 bushels of corn, is a little, I won't call it misleading, but it's not very clear what they're trying to tell us here. But fundamentally, they're saying that, we produced 1,800 bushels of corn with whatever resources the economy had. And they had some labor, capital, and land, and they were able to produce 1,800 bushels of corn. So this number right here, as you can see, is an output number or a GDP number, and it's measured in real values, not measured in dollars, as you can see. It's measured in real output. It's measured in bushels of corn. So that's going to be our Y. Y is going to equal 1,800 bushels of corn. That's real GDP. And then don't forget, they also gave us the money supply and the price of a corn. So we know we can calculate one side of the equation, MV equals PY, and we know we can calculate PY because we have those numbers. We've got real GDP, and we also have our price level, $8 a bushel. We multiply these two things together, and we get $14,400. So this is now a nominal number. You can see there's a dollar sign in front of it. And what it's saying is that, okay, well, we produced 1,800 bushels of corn. That's our real output, our real GDP. But I just need to multiply it by the price that we sold per bushel, and I can get essentially our nominal GDP or our income. That's how much money we made that year. So the last piece of this is to put together the money supply equation. We know that MV equals PY. So by dividing M on both sides of this equation over here, I divide over, and I can figure out what the velocity was by dividing by the money supply. And it turns out the velocity was 4. And this makes sense because we're saying that we made $14,000 worth of transactions, but there was only 3,600 worth of actual dollars floating around. So to create that many transactions, to create those many trades, I need money to change hands 4 times. I need money to transact, to go from one person to the other, to the other, to the other 4 times in order to get this nominal GDP because my money supply is such. And that's what velocity fundamentally is essentially how many times does money change hands in a given year or a given time period. Okay, so let's look at how these things look. Velocity does not really change that much over time. There's slight changes to it, but generally stable. But you can see here any increase in the money supply increases nominal GDP. They more or less go hand in hand. And this is going to be M2. This is our money supply. And nominal GDP, this is P times Y. That's real times the price level, and you get this green line. So this is an important equation that helps us think about a lot of things in the economy, particularly inflation. Note that we generally have ideas of what velocity is, what the money supply is, and what output is. So it would be a good way to figure out what the price level can be. So this equation reflects all of these things, and it really shows us that if we keep our nominal GDP steady, or if we increase the money supply and we increase our nominal GDP, well, an increase in money supply has to increase this right-hand side. So if I increase the left-hand side by increase the money supply, I know this right-hand side needs to increase because these two things are equal. So any increase on the left by increasing the money supply, M, has to translate to something that increases on the right-hand side. The problem is, I don't know whether it's coming from the Y component or from the P component. If it's from the Y component, then that's great because an increase in the money supply is leading to an increase in real output or real GDP, this Y right here, and that's wonderful. That's great because there's more goods in the economy, there's real growth, and that's a desirable outcome. However, if an increase in M is only coming from the P component, right? If I increase M and Y stays the same and it's just prices that go up, well, that leads to inflation. And that's a bad outcome. And that's not something we necessarily want. We'd like to see any increases in the money supply lead to increases in output, not in P. And it's difficult sometimes to disentangle these two things, whether it's coming from the price level or things coming from the real output side. Okay. So yeah, so V is relatively stable over time, doesn't really change. So now we can see that a direct change in M causes direct changes in our nominal GDP. And since V doesn't change, an M leads to a one-to-one change in nominal GDP. So if this goes up by 10%, GDP goes up by 10%, okay? But we don't know, again, where it's coming from. Is it coming from P or is it coming from Y? But if we say that, hey, M is money is neutral, right? We talk about the classical dichotomy. The classical dichotomy says that money is neutral, and money is neutral means that money does not affect real variables. Money only affects nominal variables, and that is true. We saw that in a few examples in the last video, and but we also realize that it's only true in the long term. In the short term, money does affect real variables and can change the real economy. But if we're going to say in the long run, M does not affect the real economy. In the long run, it does not have any change in real output. Then M only changes P, right? Money supply only changes the price level, since Y doesn't change with M. But we have seen that M does change Y only in the short run, and we'll see that in a few more chapters at later stages. Okay, so let's look at some examples and let's change a few things now. So this is the same example that we just saw. We have 1,800 bushels of corn. That's our real output. We've got our money supply, 3,600. We've got our price level, $8 a bushel. And then we say, hey, in 2020, something happened and the Federal Reserve increases the money supply by 10%. So this is economic stimulus. Right? This is trying to inject the economy with a lot of liquidity or a lot of cash. And hopefully what we'll see, usually when the Fed or any central bank engages in stuff like this, what they're trying to do is they're trying to stimulate their economy so that it grows. And let's just see that in action. So now we're going to try to compute the 2020 values of nominal GDP and the inflation rate. And we're going to look at another scenario where we say, hey, how about what happens when real GDP changes in 2020 and what happens then? So let's look at the two scenarios. So now we're going to say that, first of all, we have all our numbers for P, for M, and for V, and we needed to calculate V, and we did that in the last example when we looked at it just alone. We found that V equals 4. So this is just that part. So to calculate the nominal GDP for 2020, knowing the money supply increased by 10%, well, if we increase the money supply to 10%, what we find is that nominal GDP equals P times Y, which is equal to M times V. Money supply is 3,960. Why? Well, because we had money supply equal 3,600 to begin with. We said that the money supply has increased by 10%. So 10% of 3,600 is 360. Add 360 to this original number, and you get 3,960. So this is our new money supply. Now we're just going to plug it in to the equation, knowing that velocity is constant, right? We know that velocity doesn't change. So we can take M and multiply it by V, and that's this 4. And we know now that nominal GDP is going to be 15,840. This is a little bit higher than what we saw last time, because if you see what we have last time, is only 8 times 1,800, but by increasing the money supply by 10%, we get a larger number. Okay? So now we need to figure out what the inflation rate is. So what we can do is we can use the same equation, and we can say, well, if we're going to assume that Y hasn't changed, if we're going to assume that we're still stuck at this old y of 1800, then just by dividing this number, by dividing the number that we got, 15,840, which is our MV, we just divide it by y, and we get that the price level was 880. Now this is different from what the price level used to be over here at $8. We're saying after the money supply increased by 10% to 3960, nominal GDP was such, but we're still using this old y. We're still using that real output hasn't changed. It's just at 1800. And as a result, all the changes in money supply is now being pushed into the P component. Remember that I told you if we have an increase in M over here, it can go and increase this entire term. But we don't know, is it going to increase the P part or is it going to increase the Y part? In this particular example, we said that, hey, we're going to stick to the old Y. And by saying that we're going to stick to the old Y, we're saying that Y is not going to change at all. And any change in M will lead to a change or a one-to-one change in P, because we're saying that Y is going to stay exactly the same. So if I increase this by 10%, you wouldn't be surprised to see that this P also increases by 10% because the Y is increasing at 0%. And that's what we see actually here. So look, that the price level went from $8, that's our old price level, to 880, and that's perfectly 10% because we increased the money supply by 10%. So here we go, the inflation rate, 880 minus 8 divided by 8 is going to equal to 10%. Okay, and it's the same as the money supply. Okay, let's look at the second example. And the second example says, well, everything stays the same. Let's do the same calculation, but I'm going to say now that Y isn't static, isn't set at its old level and never changes. Now we're going to say that because we increased the money supply, or maybe some technological progress caused Y to increase to 1950, as opposed to the old number of 1800. So in the example A, we were stuck with Y not changing. Now we're going to say, let's change Y a little bit. Let's say it goes from 1800 to 1950, and let's look at how inflation is going to run now. Now, just by looking at the equation, if MV equals PY, we know we're increasing the right-hand side by 10%. So we know the left-hand side, which is P times Y, you can't see it necessarily here, but if we come back over here, if we go to this PY, if we increase this by 10%, then we know this entire term, P times Y, will increase by 10%. But we now know that Y is increasing a little bit. It's going from 1800 to 950, so it's going to absorb some of that 10%. And the rest of it is going to be absorbed by the P part. The last example, we saw P absorbing all of the 10%, and any increase in the money supply by 10% was directly absorbed by P because we said Y isn't changing. But now that's going to be a little bit different because Y is changing. And as a result, P will probably increase by less than 10% because Y is taking some of that cushion and it's absorbing some of that increase. So let's see how this goes. So first of all, we need to figure out the old prices. Well, M is still going to have increased by 10%. So we're using this old MV, 15,840. And we're dividing it by our new Y, and that's going to be 1950, not 1800. So the numerator stayed the same, but the denominator is now different because now Y is a little bit higher, and we said that that's because of technological progress. So notice here, prices went up 8 to 812. So if you look at the inflation rate here, 812 minus 8 divided by 8, that's only 1.5%. And that's a lot less than the 10% that we saw. Sorry, it's a lot less than the 10% that we saw. And the reason being is because now we're letting Y grow. And in fact, it grew quite a lot from 1800 to 1950, and that's absorbing a lot of that increase in the money supply. Okay, so let's talk about some of the costs of inflation. Now, inflation does affect your purchasing power. It does affect the amount of things you can buy with whatever income you're making. So if you're making $100,000 a year and inflation grows by 10% per year, then that income of yours can purchase 10% less stuff year on year. So it becomes less especially when we think of compounding over many years, you know, a 10% on top of 10% can really add up and eat away at anyone's wealth. So the inflation tax is exactly that. It's saying that, well, when the government raises money by printing money, it's essentially a tax on everyone else who's holding their money, or essentially who's saving their wealth. So if you're taking some of your money, you're putting it in your savings account, and you're trying to save it for a rainy day, but then the government engages in a lot of printing, and they increase the money supply by a large amount to the point where inflation is something high. Well, that's pretty much a tax on your saving, because now that savings that you had stored away for a rainy day can purchase less goods and services. Okay. So we talk about the Fisher effect, and we talk about monetary neutrality, and let's not forget what that is. Monetary neutrality says that money does not affect real variables, but we saw that money does not affect real variables only in the long run. In the short run, there is going to be some effect from money to the real economy. And you know, we use the Fisher equation to say that first of all, I like to use this one because, by the way, this red equation is just a rearrangement of this right-hand side. But if you look at this left-hand side, what this is saying is that your nominal interest rate is going to equal your real plus the inflation rate. And what this is saying is that, well, the interest that you pay at the bank for any type of loan is going to equal to what you actually are paying, right? What the real interest rate is, but then also the bank takes into account inflation rate. You need to pay me back 7% plus the 2% that you need to compensate me for by the time you actually give me the payment back. Inflation would have hit, and you need to compensate me for that. So any nominal interest rate that the bank charges has two components. It says, well, I actually only need 7% on a real basis, but then I also need you to compensate me a little bit for inflation. And if inflation is 2%, well, we'll just add that 2% on top of the real interest rate to get your nominal interest rate. So this is saying that we can we should compensate lenders for receiving less valuable money. What happens is that in 5 or 10 years, when we start to repay our debts, well, we're essentially repaying those debts in inflated dollars. We're repaying those debts in money that is less valuable. And this equation right here tries to explain how we compensate for that. We have to essentially include the real interest rate plus the inflation rate as part of our nominal interest rate. Okay. So what we talk about is that if, let's go back to this equation actually. So if we say that money is neutral in the short term, that means that money does not have any effect on the real interest rate only in the short term, okay? Or sorry, only in the long term. Nominal interest rate does not have effect on the real interest rate in the long term. That means that any changes here will show up in the inflation rate. So if we increase the nominal interest rate, then that means that we're increasing the inflation rate. So here's that. This slide is saying exactly that there's a 1-for-1 adjustment of the nominal interest rate to the inflation rate. And whenever we increase the money growth, which is essentially a changing of the nominal interest rate, the result is a higher inflation rate and a higher nominal interest rate. Here's a graph showing exactly that. It's showing the nominal interest rate with inflation, and you can see these two time series track each other quite closely. Any changes in the nominal interest rate is effectively raising the inflation rate. And this nominal interest rate, this is chosen by the central bank. They can effectively choose the nominal interest rate they'd like to charge. But whatever choice they make, the inflation rate tracks that choice quite closely. So whenever we raise interest rates, inflation becomes really, really high, and vice versa. Whenever we lower nominal interest rates, inflation comes to be lower. Okay, so here's a fallacy that people bring into mind. And it says that inflation robs people of the purchasing power of their hard-earned dollars. And that's true and false at the same time. Now, it's true in the sense that it does rob you of hard-earned dollars that you earned in previous years. So, if money that you earned in 2010 and you're trying to spend in 2020, and because inflation has been quite high in 2020, then this would be true. Inflation has robbed you some of your purchasing power of money that you earned 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But of course, now and in the future, that money is less valuable. However, where it's not true is money that you earned in that same year. So money that you earned in 2020 and you spend in 2020, well, inflation still hasn't hit that cash. The reason being is because true in 2020, prices are a little bit higher. You're paying more at the pump, you're paying more for your groceries and so on and so forth. But just in the same sense, you are also getting paid more. You are getting paid more because we view labor as just another good. It's kind of the things that you buy at the grocery store. You can kind of consider that, well, if things are getting more expensive at the grocery store, then so should labor. So should be wages should be rising in the same sense. So just as things are becoming more expensive in the real world and the things that you purchase, and prices are rising, well, prices are rising also for firms in terms of purchasing and buying labor. So as a result, this is the inflation fallacy. It says that, well, yes, inflation does rob people of their purchasing power of money that they earned in previous years, money that you even earned just last year in 2019 or 2018. That definitely has inflated away over some time. But money you earn in the same year isn't affected by inflation, because any rise in prices in that year will be matched by a rise in wages. Because, well, prices are not just prices of groceries, but they're also prices for labor. And they usually go hand in hand, as you can see in this example right here. So here we've got the nominal wage, which is your dollar wage. That's the nominal part in red. And then we also have the consumer price index in blue, CPI. And the consumer price index, as we know, is just a price index for a basket of goods that kind of give us an idea of how things are, how pricey are things in the economy. And you can see that these two things more or less move hand in hand. Whenever the price of goods and services go up, we'll so do nominal wages. So one last thing about this slide, notice that since these two things are going up more or less in tandem, don't forget that the real wage, which is nominal wage divided by CPI, is more or less the same and hasn't really changed over the long run. So by dividing these two numbers, one on top of the other, you get your real wage, and you can start to see that the real wage is pretty stable over time. Okay, one last or a few more examples on the cost of inflation. We've got the shoe leather cost, and the shoe leather cost is essentially a cost that we, as the holders of money, incur. So the idea here is that, well, because you know that inflation is hitting any type of currency, any type of cash, we're going to not keep cash in our bank account and not keep cash in liquid or not, well, liquid form, yes, but in cash form and currency form, because well, inflation is just eating away at currency. What I'd like to do is I'd like to keep this money in a savings account that's earning some interest, or I'd like to keep it in stocks or bonds, something that's not just being eaten away at cash. And as a result, you waste a lot of resources trying to do that. You waste a lot of resources going to the bank, coming back to the bank, and that's where the word shoe leather comes from. It says that you're kind of wearing out the leather on your shoes by going to the bank and coming back from the bank and trying to sell your assets and keep them in a non-liquid or non-currency form so that inflation doesn't eat away from it. And that's an unproductive activity. It's not useful for you or for anyone in the economy, just by you going to and from the bank trying to protect yourself from inflation. So this is a cost that's on consumers. This is a cost that's on people, on the people who hold cash. Menu cost is a cost that is incurred on firms, and just like consumers or households have inflation costs, firms have menu costs. And the idea here is that, well, firms are constantly having to change their menu prices. It's difficult for them to keep in mind how prices are changing in the economy and what's going on. And it becomes very difficult for them to figure out what is the true price or what is the right price that we should charge for a particular good or for a particular service. So that creates unnecessary costs for the firm. They need to try to figure out what are the true right prices, what are the true prices, how often should I update prices, and that's an unproductive activity for firms. You'd want them to focus on their core business and their true product rather than running around trying to figure out what prices are and trying to update them on menus. So there is a cost to firms, and those are called menu costs. Here's another thing that we can talk about when we talk about inflation. So when firms are updating their prices and they're changing, so you got tacos that are changing prices, burritos that are changing prices, hot dogs and McDonald's are changing prices, and they're not all changing prices at the same time. They're not all waking up and kind of coming together and saying, all right, well, today, because of inflation, we're going to all unanimously update our prices by 5 or 10%. What's happening is that they're changing prices at different times. And they're maybe, the hot dog industry changes first, but then is followed by the burger industry, followed by the taco industry, so on and so forth. And in that time, when there's some industries that have updated their prices while others have not, well, that creates some relative price variability. And what that does, that shows that relative prices start to change, and they vary they vary a lot in that time, and that creates distortions in the market. That creates distortions that are not clear. What are the true prices? Are tacos really expensive today, or did they just update their prices last night? And because of that, that makes decisions more difficult. We don't really know what are the true prices. Are these prices because something's out of sync right now and people didn't update at the right time in the right moment, and these prices need to adjust in a few days? Or is it really that tacos are really expensive versus other foods? So because firms don't all update their prices at the same time, and some do and some don't, but eventually everyone will, during that time, that creates a lot of variance in the relative prices, and it makes the decisions a little bit more difficult to make because prices are now a little bit more distorted. We don't know what the true price is. Okay, here's the last one, and it's going to be related to taxes. And the idea here is that, well, taxes are based on nominal income, and that means that they're not adjusted for inflation. So that means if inflation is high and your nominal income doesn't change much, you're actually going to be paying more, or your money is going to be eaten away by inflation. Since we don't tax people based on the real income, inflation causes people to pay more in taxes even when the real income doesn't change. And the idea here is that, well, because we're taxing people on their nominal income, and sometimes nominal income grows faster than real income, there's larger changes. It becomes more difficult to figure out how much people are paying in taxes. Are they paying more? Are they paying less? And it just creates a more of a distortion when it comes to taxes. And here's one last thing. It's just confusing. It's confusing for firms and consumers and for governments when inflation is high, because no one really knows how much is a dollar worth. If a dollar is kind of a yardstick or a ruler that we use to measure transactions, if it's a sort of ruler to measure value or cost, how much does a Prius cost versus how much does a Ferrari cost? Well, the dollar is really useful for us to kind of measure that. And if the dollar's constantly changing, if the value of the dollar is constantly changing, well, it becomes very difficult for us to compare different goods. We'd like to have the dollar be pretty stable. We know what a dollar is, so that when we use it to measure different goods and services, things don't get confusing. Okay, here's another cost of inflation. So first of all, who benefits from inflation? Notice that the people who benefit from inflation are the people who are in debt. If you are in debt and you're going to pay back your debt in 10 years, well, good for you, because that debt that you pay is now going to be repaid in dollars that have lower value. And that's going to be better for you because you're paying off essentially a cheaper debt. If you are in debt, you actually benefit a lot from inflation because you pay off that debt in dollars that are inflated and they're not very valuable. Of course, bankers know this in advance, and that's why they take that into account. But on unexpected inflation, is definitely good for debtors, and it's very bad for creditors, people who are going to be paid in 10 years because they lent out their money in 2010 and they're going to be paid in 2020, but now they're being paid with these less valuable dollars. They're the ones who are really hit by inflation. So notice that there's some people who benefit and some people who do not benefit from inflation. The people who benefit from inflation are actually people who are in debt and generally a little bit poorer than the creditors who are wealthy and are essentially lending out their money. So inflation is actually good for debtors and bad for creditors. And any unexpected inflation creates an arbitrary redistribution of wealth from debtors to creditors, from the people who were in debt to the people who gave that debt out. And that's pretty arbitrary. There's no real reason for that sort of redistribution. True, some people benefit, other people lose, but it's pretty arbitrary and it's unnecessary and unuseful for people in the economy. Okay, so that's essentially the chapter for chapter 17, where we discussed money supply and inflation. And really just to kind of recap this chapter, what we've really talked about is that governments engage in monetary policy. They engage in monetary policy because they're trying to smooth markets. They're trying to induce growth in the economy, and they're trying to heal certain parts that they believe are affected. And they can do that by two mechanisms. The first is fiscal policy, and that's spending. Well, the second is monetary policy, and that's going to be changing the money supply. By increasing the money supply, they inject a lot of money into the economy, and that helps the economy heal. And by soaking up cash or taking away money from the economy, they contract the economy. And what we're saying here is that, well, by increasing the money supply, that's great. That may help grow the economy, but there is going to be a cost of inflation associated with that. And we might end up having too much of a rise in prices, right? A rise in P, and that's essentially inflation. And that could be harmful and not useful for our economy. So that's really what we're trying to teach here. Right? We're saying that, well, increasing the money supply is great, but when we overdo it, we risk reaching inflation, and that's not particularly useful for us or helpful. Okay, so this is the last chapter before our midterm. Our midterm is going to be right after spring break with more announcements on that. If there's anything that's unclear in terms of when or what is included on the midterm, everything is on the syllabus. So take a look at that. Okay, bye-bye.